It was late afternoon in a busy supermarket parking lot, where lines of cars came and went in an endless stream of errands. Most people were so lost in their daily routines that they barely noticed anything around them. But in a quiet corner, sitting on the asphalt near the store entrance, was Brian, a homeless man in his late 40s who had seen better days. His clothes were worn and dusty, and lines of fatigue etched across his face spoke of countless nights sleeping under bridges or on park benches. Next to Brian sat Rusty, a medium-sized dog with a patchy brown coat. The dog's ears perked at every sudden sound, but he remained calm, perhaps because Brian's presence reassured him. Anyone passing by might have overlooked them both. Brian held a piece of battered cardboard reading, "Please help me and my friend." Occasionally, a kind stranger dropped a few coins into the small tin can at Brian's side. But more often than not, people walked past without a glance, their minds on groceries, errands, or their next meal. Brian and Rusty had been inseparable ever since a frigid winter night weeks ago. Brian had been battling a fever, shivering behind the very supermarket where he now sat. He'd nearly lost hope, believing he wouldn't survive until morning. Then, out of the darkness, Rusty appeared, skinny and seemingly forgotten by the world as well. Without barking or causing a fuss, the dog curled up beside Brian, sharing body warmth and a small glimmer of comfort. When dawn arrived, Brian felt an inexplicable renewal of spirit. Ever since that night, Brian vowed not to abandon Rusty. The dog had been his only companion, a light in the darkness. On this afternoon, the routine felt no different from any other. Brian shifted his aching limbs, and Rusty sniffed at the ground, sensing who might be approaching. Shoppers bustled about, pushing squeaky carts, loading groceries into their trunks, and talking on cell phones. None of them paid much attention to the pair living on the edge of their vision. It was a day much like any other, until the distant roar of a motorcycle engine shattered the usual parking lot soundtrack. The sound grew louder as the motorcycle rumbled across the pavement. Heads turned. Brian also glanced up to see who had arrived with such a dramatic entrance. The bike skidded to a halt in a parking space not far from where Brian sat. Atop the motorcycle was Mason, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a black leather jacket scuffed from many rides. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face twisted into a sneer. His presence radiated an energy that made passers-by quicken their steps to avoid him. Mason swung his leg off the bike and lingered for a moment as though savoring the attention. Then he began walking, his boots thudding heavily on the asphalt. Those who noticed him made sure to steer clear. Brian instinctively hunched his shoulders, hoping to remain invisible. But Mason's piercing gaze had already locked onto him. "Well, what do we have here?" Mason drawled, stopping just a few feet away from Brian and Rusty. He looked them over, Brian clinging to his sign, Rusty peering up with cautious eyes. "Some folks think they can just take up space around here, I guess," Mason muttered, his lip curling. Brian said nothing, too wary to engage. Rusty, picking up his owner's apprehension, gave a low growl. That sound, almost imperceptible, stoked something cruel in Mason. "You better watch that mutt," Mason warned, turning fully toward Rusty. "They bite sometimes, and I don't like biters." His gaze flicked to Brian. "Teach your dog some manners." "Got it." Brian's throat went dry. He mumbled something about meaning no harm, but Mason either didn't hear or didn't care. Then, in one swift motion, Mason lifted his foot in Rusty's direction. Brian gasped. Rusty yelped, scrambling backward. The blow grazed the dog's flank, causing Rusty to spin in shock. Brian blurted, "Stop," but his voice was lost amid the jarring scene. A few people nearby froze in disbelief. One or two even started to approach, but Mason's imposing figure and threatening glare kept them at bay. "Why don't you get lost, old man?" Mason barked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You and your mangy dog don't belong here anyway. This is a place for customers, not freeloaders." Brian, heart pounding, tried to calm Rusty by stroking the dog's neck. Rusty's trembling receded a little under Brian's touch. Mason's sneer grew. "Haven't you got anything to say?" he challenged, stepping even closer. Or are you both just a couple of worthless strays? Brian wanted to speak up, but fear clutched his throat. All he managed was a pleading shake of his head. Rusty stood rigid, fur raised, ready to defend Brian if it came to that. It might have escalated further if not for the presence of someone quietly watching from a row of parked cars. Unnoticed till now, that observer decided enough was enough. A steady, clear voice pierced the tension. That's enough. Leave them alone. Heads turned. Mason paused, frowning as he tried to see who had dared intervene. Emerging from the subdued light behind the SUVs stood Keanu Reeves, dressed in jeans and a simple dark jacket. He wore a serious expression, a calm but firm look that signaled he wouldn't stand by while cruelty happened. In that moment, fate set in motion a series of events that would unfold dramatically in the supermarket parking lot. A hush fell over the immediate area as Keanu Reeves stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the pavement. Almost everyone recognized him. Whispers rippled through the crowd. That's Keanu Reeves. Is that really him? What's he doing here? But while some onlookers were starstruck, Mason was not. He turned his full attention to the newcomer, a sneer still twisting his lips. "And who do you think you are?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You just walk in and act like you own the place?" Keanu's gaze flickered toward Brian, noting the man's trembling posture and Rusty's defensive stance. Slowly, Keanu returned his attention to Mason. "I'm someone who believes in showing a little compassion," he said in a steady voice. "Kicking a defenseless dog doesn't exactly scream tough guy to me." Mason bristled. He was clearly not expecting a challenge, let alone from a celebrity. He took a step closer to Keanu, trying to leverage his height and bulk. "I don't need advice from some actor," he snarled. "This isn't a movie scene. This is real life." A few onlookers cautiously approached, phones in hand, sensing something big was unfolding. Brian, meanwhile, kept a hand on Rusty, trying to keep the dog calm. He shot a grateful glance at Keanu, though he wasn't sure this confrontation would end well. Mason still looked poised to lash out at anyone who dared stand in his way. Keanu Reeves did not flinch. He observed Mason, noticing the tension in the man's face, the aggression in his posture. Yet Keanu's own bearing remained composed, his voice measured. "I'm not here to put on a show," he said, nodding slightly toward the scattering crowd of phone-wielding spectators. "I'm here because what you're doing is wrong." Mason let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, it's wrong, is it? So says the millionaire who's never struggled a day in his life." He pointed an accusatory finger at Keanu. "People like you have no idea what it's like down here. You don't know me, and you definitely don't tell me what to do." Keanu's eyes flickered with empathy, but he didn't move from his spot. "Maybe I don't know what you're going through," he conceded, keeping his voice calm. "But I do know hurting that man or his dog won't solve anything for you. It'll just make more pain." For a moment, Mason seemed to waver. A flicker of uncertainty, or perhaps shame, crossed his face before he replaced it with another scowl. "Spare me the lecture," he spat. "If they can't handle a little rough treatment, they shouldn't be here." He gestured dismissively at Brian and Rusty. "They're not even paying customers. They're just mooching off everyone else." At that, Brian finally found his voice. He looked up, his tired eyes shining with a mixture of fear and resolve. "We're not trying to bother anyone," Brian said, his voice shaking. "I've tried to find work, but times got tough. This dog saved my life when no one else cared. We don't want trouble, we just want to get by." Mason rolled his eyes as if unmoved by Brian's plea. Yeah, sob story. "You're not the only one with problems," he shot back. But the crowd stirring around them seemed less convinced by Mason's contempt. A few individuals whispered among themselves, disapproving of his cruelty. Others craned their necks to see how Keanu Reeves would handle this. An older gentleman with a grocery cart cleared his throat. "Son," he addressed Mason, "why don't you just leave them alone? This isn't right." Mason ignored him, narrowing his gaze at Keanu, who remained poised, arms relaxed at his sides but not backing away. "Look, buddy," Mason growled. "Why don't you step aside? This doesn't concern you. You see a dog and a beggar, And you think you need to be a hero? The last word dripped with sarcasm. Keanu paused, as if carefully choosing his words. I don't see a beggar or a dog, he said gently. I see a man and his friend, both of whom have done nothing to deserve your anger. Mason let out a snort, but it lacked the earlier confidence. You're really itching for a fight, aren't you? He challenged, taking another step forward. Keanu, however, remained unflustered. No, I'm really not, he said, his voice low but resolute. I just want you to walk away from this before it goes too far. At that instant, Rusty let out a small bark, as if backing up Keanu's request. Mason's eyes flickered to the dog, and for a moment, something akin to regret flashed across his features. But just as quickly, he hardened again. Walk away, huh? He repeated, tapping the toe of his heavy boot on the ground. Maybe I will. Or maybe I'll make an example of anyone who stands in my way. The crowd collectively tensed. A young woman whispered to her friend, Is anyone calling the cops? Another man stepped back to keep a safe distance. Brian clutched Rusty closer, his heart pounding at the thought of violence escalating. Keanu's unwavering presence was the only thing standing between Mason and a more vicious confrontation. Mason's glare drifted over the handful of people filming. The longer the scene went on, the more likely it would end up all over social media. He could feel the heat of judgment from strangers who cared more about a homeless man and his dog than about him or his problems. Anger and embarrassment warred in his mind. Yet there was something about Keanu's calm expression that kept him from acting on his worst impulses. Finally, Mason shook his head, almost in disbelief. You're all insane, he muttered. Fine. If you want to be these losers' guardian angel, be my guest. He pointed an accusing finger at Keanu. But don't think this is over. With that, Mason turned abruptly, stomping back toward his motorcycle. The onlookers exhaled a collective breath of relief, though no one was quite sure if the threat had truly passed. Keanu Reeves watched Mason closely, ensuring he didn't lash out again as he hopped onto his bike. Mason revved the engine, sending a roar through the lot. For a second, it seemed he might circle back. Instead, he shot Keanu one last venomous glare, then sped off, leaving a whiff of exhaust and tension in his wake. Brian's shoulders sagged. Rusty let out a quiet whimper, pressing closer to his human companion. A strange stillness descended, like the moment after a storm passes, but before anyone is sure it's truly gone. Keanu approached Brian and Rusty, kneeling so he was at their eye level. Are you two all right? He asked softly. Brian nodded, tears brimming at the edges of his eyes. Thank you, he managed to say. I didn't know what to do. That man, he was so angry. Keanu offered a reassuring smile. It's okay now. Let's make sure you're safe. He gently patted Rusty's head. The dog sniffed his hand, tail wagging faintly as if sensing Keanu's kindness. Around them, the onlookers began to disperse, their adrenaline fading. Though they had recognized Keanu, they had witnessed something more than a celebrity cameo. They had seen decency in action. As soon as Mason's motorcycle disappeared down the busy street, a crowd of relieved shoppers and bystanders gathered a bit closer. A short woman with glasses stepped up, offering Brian a bottle of water and a few dollars. I'm so sorry, she said, voice trembling with emotion. I saw everything, but I was too scared to intervene. I'm glad he showed up, she added, nodding toward Keanu. Brian accepted the water gratefully, twisting off the cap to give Rusty a chance to lap some of it up. The dog drank eagerly, still shaking off the fright from moments before. Keanu observed quietly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign that Mason might return. Satisfied that the biker was gone for now, he looked back at Brian. I'm Keanu, he said, though everyone around obviously knew who he was. Brian offered a humble nod, murmuring his own name in return. Rusty pawed at Keanu's leg, seemingly trying to express thanks in dog language. Keanu smiled and gently scratched the dog behind the ears. A security guard hurried over, winded and apologizing for not arriving sooner. He introduced himself as Henderson, explaining he had been doing his rounds on the far side of the supermarket complex. I heard shouting but got here too late, Henderson said, glancing around at the dispersing crowd. Is everyone all right? Keanu nodded. We're fine, he said. The guy's gone now, but it might be a good idea to keep an eye out for him. Henderson looked at Brian with a mixture of pity and concern. You sure you're okay? That biker was out of line, he said. Brian nodded, still shaken. I think so. Just need a moment to recover. The small audience that had gathered began to applaud softly, praising Keanu for stepping in. Someone commented, not every day you see a celebrity stand up to a bully like that. Another added, we need more people like you, famous or not. Keanu, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, simply offered a polite grin. I just did what anyone should do, he murmured. Soon enough, most bystanders returned to their own tasks, the excitement fading into distant memory. But for Brian and Rusty, the moment was life-changing. An older gentleman wearing a baseball cap approached with a gentle smile. You take care of yourself, he told Brian. And that dog of yours is a true friend. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Then he slipped an envelope with some cash into Brian's hand. Use it for whatever you need. Overwhelmed, Brian offered a trembling thank you. Keanu realized Brian was still clutching his cardboard sign, which read, Please help me and my friend. The sign looked as battered as its owner. Is there somewhere safe you can go? Keanu asked, his voice kind but concerned. Brian shook his head. No, I haven't been able to get steady work. Shelters are full most nights. Rusty and I usually find a spot away from the crowds. Keanu's expression grew thoughtful. Without fanfare, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Brian. Look, he said, I know a guy who manages a small outreach program nearby. They can sometimes help with short-term housing, or at least put you on a list. Give them a call, tell them I sent you, and that you have a dog. Don't let them turn you away because of Rusty. Brian stared at the card, hardly believing his eyes. You do that for me? He asked, voice trembling. Keanu nodded. Everyone deserves a chance. You especially. It's the least I can do. Brian swallowed hard, tears threatening to escape. Rusty, as if sensing the emotional tide, nudged Brian's hand. Meanwhile, Henderson, the security guard, was taking down a few notes about the incident. I'll file a report, he said. Not much else we can do unless that biker comes back. But if he does, we'll be ready. Keanu nodded in appreciation. Thanks. And please keep an eye on Brian and Rusty, if you can, he asked. Henderson gave a curt nod, respect evident in his eyes. The tension in the air receded, replaced by a quieter kind of energy, a shared sense that something important had happened, though it was hard to put into words. Lives had intersected in a way none of them expected. The woman with glasses from earlier reappeared, handing Brian a small bag filled with sandwiches and fruit. For you and your dog, she said softly. I'm sorry for not standing up sooner. Brian accepted it with gratitude. It means a lot, he whispered. He cast a glance at Keanu. I never thought someone like you would even notice me, let alone help me, he confessed. Keanu rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I'm just a person, he said. No different from you in the grand scheme of things. We all need help sometimes. A faint smile tugged at Brian's lips. I guess so. He looked down at Rusty, who was still licking the last droplets of water from the bottle. The dog let out a small sigh, almost as if relieved the ordeal was over. In the distance, a light breeze carried away the lingering tension. Yet a nagging feeling remained, that Mason might return or that Brian and Rusty's challenges were far from resolved. Keanu seemed to share that concern. Do me a favor, he said to Brian. Don't stay here too late. Give that number a call as soon as you can. Promise me? Brian nodded, tears welling again. I promise, he managed. At that, Keanu offered a reassuring pat on Brian's shoulder. Then I guess my work here is done, he said, scanning the lot. Take care of yourself, Brian. Take care of Rusty. As Keanu began to walk away, the quiet circle of onlookers parted to let him through. He gave a final wave, not wanting any grand send-off, just a return to normalcy. But for Brian, normal was a life that meant scraping by on the streets, hoping for small acts of kindness. Henderson and a few other compassionate souls lingered a moment, making sure Mason was truly gone. Finally, Henderson walked off to resume his patrol, reminding Brian that if anything else happened, he could come find him. Brian nodded, touched by the gesture. So there Brian and Rusty remained. Not only Keanu Reeves, but also small acts of empathy from unknown faces. It was enough to make one believe that goodness could flourish, even in unexpected corners of the world. Nightfall settled over the city, bringing cooler air and the glow of streetlights. Brian and Rusty found a quieter patch of sidewalk near a bus stop bench, not far from the supermarket. Brian hadn't yet called the outreach number Keanu gave him. He still felt unsteady, emotionally and physically. But he clutched the business card like a talisman, a sign that someone out there cared. As the moon rose higher, Brian slipped into a restless sleep, Rusty curled protectively at his side. The memory of Mason's furious gaze, the sound of that roaring motorcycle, and Keanu's calm intervention all played in Brian's mind. Some part of him worried that Mason might suddenly return, looking for a fight. Another part reflected on the miraculous timing of Keanu's arrival. Come morning, Brian woke to Rusty licking his cheek. A small group of pigeons had gathered, pecking for crumbs in the gutters. The night had passed without further incidents, but he knew he couldn't rely on luck alone. He decided it was time to use that phone number. Gathering his sparse belongings, Brian headed for a nearby public library that offered free internet and phone access. He took a seat at one of the worn desks and dialed the number, heart pounding with each ring. A receptionist answered. Brian cleared his throat. Hi, my name is Brian, and I'm calling because Keanu Reeves told me to get in touch. I have a dog and I need help. The words tumbled out awkwardly, but the receptionist responded kindly, explaining that a staff member would meet him at a designated spot that afternoon. Brian jotted down the details, relieved yet nervous. He had no idea if this outreach would truly help him, but it was worth a try. At midday, he and Rusty arrived at the agreed meeting point, a small church parking lot. Sure enough, a white van pulled in, emblazoned with the logo of a local homeless outreach program. A middle-aged man named Felix stepped out, wearing a friendly smile. Hey, are you Brian? He asked. We got the call about you. Brian nodded, voice shaky with gratitude. Yeah, that's me. This is Rusty, he said, patting his dog's head. Rusty eyed Felix curiously, tail wagging just enough to show he sensed kindness. Felix explained that the outreach center could offer short-term shelter options. However, they typically didn't allow pets unless they were service animals. Brian's face fell. Rusty isn't a service animal, but I can't abandon him. He's my only family, Brian pleaded, his voice raw with desperation. Felix hesitated, looking at the dog's expectant eyes. Let me see what I can do, he finally offered. We might be able to arrange something temporarily. We do owe a favor to Mr. Reeves. We never expected to hear from him, but the minute he called, we knew it had to be urgent. Tears pricked Brian's eyes again. He couldn't believe that a movie star had made this happen. Thank you, he whispered. Rusty means everything to me. Felix nodded and motioned for Brian to follow him into the van. They drove toward the outreach facility, a modest building on the outskirts of the city. As they arrived, staff members greeted Brian warmly. A couple of them cooed over Rusty, offering dog treats. Brian felt a wave of relief. He had rarely encountered such open arms. They showed him a small room he could use for a few days. Nothing fancy, just a cot and a dresser. We'll work on something more permanent, Felix assured him. But at least for tonight, you and Rusty have a place to stay. Brian stood there, overwhelmed. The simplest of comforts, a roof, a bed, a safe place for Rusty, felt like a luxury beyond measure. Over the next few days, Brian met with a caseworker who asked about his background, his job skills, and his hopes for the future. He learned about job placement programs and counseling services. Rusty underwent a brief health check by a volunteer vet, ensuring the dog was in decent shape aside from some minor issues easily remedied with proper nutrition. All the while, a thought lingered in Brian's mind. He owed all of this to Keanu Reeves stepping in that day at the supermarket. Without that chance encounter, he might still be on the street. or worse. One evening, after a simple but satisfying meal at the shelter, Brian asked Felix if there was any way to contact Keanu to thank him. Felix chuckled, admitting he didn't have a direct line to the movie star. He only left us a voicemail that day. But maybe if our center can show we're making a difference, he'll check in again. Despite his uncertainty about ever seeing Keanu Reeves again, Brian felt an ember of hope glowing inside him. In spare moments, he'd wander the small courtyard behind the outreach center with Rusty, reflecting on how drastically his life had shifted in just a short time. He had gone from a sense of hopelessness to having a real shot at stability. Yet, in the back of his mind, Brian couldn't forget Mason. The man's anger had seemed deep-seated, and Brian knew individuals like that could resurface at any time. Still, he pushed those fears aside, focusing on each step forward. The world could be terrifying, but it could also be kind. Rusty's wagging tail reminded him of that daily. A few weeks passed, and Brian found a fragile new rhythm in life. He met regularly with a counselor to address some lingering emotional wounds, and spent his mornings distributing resumes at local businesses, hoping someone would give him a second chance. By afternoon, he returned to the shelter for Rusty's feeding time and to help out with small chores. In that period, the story of Keanu Reeves confronting a bullying biker had spread across social media. Witnesses had posted short clips online, capturing the moment when Keanu stepped between Brian, Rusty, and Mason. Comments poured in from people worldwide praising Keanu's compassion and denouncing animal abuse. Brian found the public interest surreal. He caught glimpses of those videos on donated laptops at the shelter, his own face partially visible in some shots. Each time he watched, he felt an odd mix of gratitude and embarrassment. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted to live quietly and care for Rusty. Then, late one afternoon, Felix excitedly approached Brian with news. "We have a lead on a job for you," he said. "A small warehouse downtown is looking for extra help. They're willing to let you bring Rusty if you can keep him in a safe area on breaks." Brian's heart soared. This was exactly the kind of break he needed. Steady work and a chance to keep Rusty nearby. "That's fantastic," he breathed, filled with renewed optimism. Brian prepared for a meeting with the warehouse manager. He borrowed a clean shirt and pants from the shelter's clothing donations. Rusty wagged his tail happily as if sensing Brian's excitement. But fate had another surprise in store. On his way to the warehouse, Brian decided to stop by the supermarket parking lot where everything began. He felt a desire to see the place from a fresh perspective. The day was sunny and warm as Brian and Rusty stepped onto that same stretch of asphalt. It felt strange to be there without the weight of uncertainty crushing him. He walked near the spot he once occupied, his sign reading, "Please help me and my friend." Now, he stood a bit taller. Rusty, too, seemed to sense the new energy, sniffing around with curiosity. Suddenly, the roar of a motorcycle engine rattled the air. Brian's stomach twisted in fear, instantly recalling Mason's face. He clutched Rusty's leash, preparing himself for the worst. But when the bike came into view, he saw a different rider. Someone younger, wearing a bright red helmet, who parked without so much as a glance in Brian's direction. Brian exhaled relief. Just as he was about to leave, a black SUV pulled up. Out stepped Keanu Reeves, wearing casual attire and sunglasses. Brian's jaw dropped in astonishment. "Keanu," he called out hesitantly. Keanu turned, recognized Brian, and removed his sunglasses with a smile. "Brian, Rusty, good to see you both," he greeted warmly. Brian felt a flood of emotions. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Keanu explained that he sometimes shopped at this supermarket whenever he was in town. Plus, word had reached him that the outreach center was making progress. "Felix texted me to say you were doing well," Keanu said, "so I figured I'd drop by to see if I'd run into you." Tears welled in Brian's eyes. "I can't thank you enough," he managed. He recounted how the outreach had taken him in, how he'd found potential work at the warehouse, and how Rusty was healthier than ever. Keanu patted Rusty's head, seeing the dog's brighter, more energetic look. "This is what I was hoping for," Keanu said, genuine relief in his voice. They chatted briefly near the rows of cars. Brian told him about the viral video of their confrontation with Mason. Keanu grimaced slightly, admitting he wasn't keen on the publicity. But, he added, if it helped spread some awareness about helping people and animals in need, maybe it's worth it. Brian nodded, glancing at Rusty. All I know is that you saved us when no one else dared step in. Keanu shook his head softly. You and Rusty saved each other a long time ago, he countered. I just nudged things along. Before departing, Keanu inquired if Brian needed anything else. Brian paused, tears brimming yet again. Just keep being who you are, he said. Because if the world had more people willing to do what you did, we'd all be better off. Keanu gave Brian a heartfelt embrace, then offered a short wave as he headed into the store. Brian watched Keanu walk away, gratitude swelling in his chest. Rusty pressed against Brian's leg, sensing the warmth of the moment. The memory of Mason's cruelty felt more distant now, overshadowed by kindness and hope. Brian realized that life would remain an uphill climb, but he also knew a single moment of compassion could echo far beyond its origin. Armed with that thought, Brian gave Rusty's leash a gentle tug. They had a warehouse manager to meet and a new chapter of life waiting to begin. As the two of them strolled off, the sun seemed brighter, the breeze gentler, and the world felt like a place where good could triumph, one act of caring at a time. This story began with an unsettling act of cruelty. A homeless man and his loyal dog caught in the wrath of someone who had misplaced his anger. Yet, in a moment of adversity, fate intervened when Keanu Reeves stepped forward, reminding us all that courage can take many forms. Sometimes it's a movie star risking his safety to protect the powerless. Sometimes it's a security guard, a concerned bystander, or a shelter worker who offers resources and hope. For Brian, this encounter was life-altering. He discovered he wasn't alone in the world. A single act of kindness had the power to reshape his destiny. Through a chance meeting and the simple generosity of strangers, Brian found the path toward stability he had nearly given up on. Rusty, the faithful dog who once saved Brian's life on a frigid night, remained at his side, symbolizing unwavering loyalty and the healing bond between humans and animals. But this story isn't just about one man or one dog. It's a reminder that even the smallest gesture, offering a meal, helping someone find shelter, or intervening when harm is being done, can set off a chain reaction of good. Whether famous or unknown, each of us has the capacity to make a difference. Mason's cruelty was overshadowed by compassion, showing that while negativity exists, it can be overcome by people who choose to do the right thing. In the end, what matters is not how famous or influential we are, but whether we dare to care when it counts. Brian's journey continues with newfound hope, and Rusty remains his loyal companion. Their story stands as a powerful testament that empathy, generosity, and moral courage can and will prevail.